Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at how flood risk affects the value of homes,
Okay.
specifically in Richmond, New South Wales, Australia. Now, you're already familiar with disaster risk reduction, so we
Yes.
can skip the basics and really get right into the specifics of this research.
Sounds good.
This study uses real estate data and flood maps
Uh-huh.
to explore how perceptions of flood risk, measured by the annual exceedance probability,
Yes.
or AEP, impact the prices homes sell for.
Right.
It reveals some interesting findings about how people assess flood risk and what that means for homeowners and policymakers.
Right.
The Hawkesbury-Nepean region,
Mm-hmm.
where Richmond is located, is known for its history of flooding,
Yes,
making it a pretty compelling case study.
it is indeed. This area actually experienced a 28-year cycle dominated by drought,
Oh, wow.
followed by a shift to a flood-dominated cycle starting in 2020.
Interesting.
There were 5 significant floods in just 4 years.
Wow.
2 were classified as major, exceeding 9 meters above sea level.
That's major way.
And 3 floods in 2021 and 2022 even went beyond that major threshold of 12 meters.
So that recent history certainly highlights the relevance of this research. Can you tell us about the researchers' approach to understanding how these floods affected home values?
Yeah, so they combined real estate transaction data, flood maps, and some advanced statistical methods to see how flood risk affected home prices. They took into account property features like the number of bedrooms and bathrooms, location aspects like distance to the central business district, and elevation, and importantly, the AEP.
And for those unfamiliar, the AEP measures how likely a property is to flood in a given year.
That's right.
So a lower AEP means a higher risk of flooding.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do they group the properties based on their AEP?
So properties with an AEP of 100 or less were classified as high risk. Those with AEPs between 100 and 500 were medium risk, and those between 500 and 1,000 were low risk. Anything above 1,000 was considered to have extremely low or no risk.
And what did they find when they compared these risk categories with home prices?
Well, homes in the high-risk flood zones, those with an AEP of 100 or less, sold for approximately 10.8% less than homes in areas with very low or no risk.
So it seems the market does acknowledge and price in flood risk to some extent.
Yeah, it seems so.
It does. But it's not just the high-risk zones. Even homes in medium-risk zones with AEPs between 100 and 500 saw a discount of about 4.4%.
That's right.
So it's clear that people factor in the possibility of floods when buying or selling homes. Did the researchers find this awareness consistent across all risk levels?
Interestingly, no homes in low-risk zones with ADPs between 500 and 1,000 showed no statistically significant price difference compared to homes in very low or no-risk areas.
It seems that while buyers and sellers respond to higher levels of risk, maybe because they've seen the effects of flooding, they might downplay the risk when the probability seems lower.
You could say that it suggests there's a limit to how much people consider flood risk, even when the potential consequences could be significant. The researchers call this a cognitive limit. They also found that this perception of risk can be further influenced by updates to flood maps. Remember, the Hawkesbury-Nepean Valley had a flood map update in 2023.
Right. They compared the AEP ratings from the 2019 flood maps with the updated 2023 maps to see how these changes in perceived risk affected property prices. What did they discover?
They found that when a home's risk rating was upgraded, meaning it was now considered at higher risk of flooding, the price discount was even larger than before the update.
That emphasizes the importance of having accurate and current flood risk information.
Definitely.
It directly impacts property values.
Precisely. But even with this updated information, they observed a fascinating pattern. People generally reacted to upgrades in risk from AEP 1000 to AEP 500, but they didn't seem to react when their risk was upgraded from above AEP 1000 to AEP 1000.
So even with this new information, there seems to be a threshold below which people don't fully grasp the risk. It's as if a certain level of risk just doesn't register as significant even when you tell them it's increased.
That's one way to put it. It raises concerns about how people process risk information.
This has implications not only for homeowners, but also for policymakers involved in disaster risk reduction. What are your thoughts on that?
It highlights the need for more than just flood maps and data. We need effective risk communication strategies that help people understand what these numbers mean in their lives. It's not just about buying or selling, it's about making informed decisions about where to live and how to protect your property.
The study didn't stop at property values. It also looked at how flood risk affects the time a property spends on the market, providing further insight into how people make decisions. What did they find?
Properties in high-risk flood zones took significantly longer to sell. That makes sense because fewer buyers are comfortable with that level of risk. But surprisingly, homes in low-risk zones also took slightly longer to sell compared to those in medium-risk zones.
How do the researchers explain this?
They suggest this could be because people in low-risk areas are overly optimistic about flooding. They might underestimate the risk because they haven't experienced it often.
So they might not give it enough weight in their selling strategy. Even if the risk is relatively low, this delay could cost them time and money.
It could, and it reinforces the point that perceptions of risk don't always align with reality.
We've established that flood risk measured by AEP has a noticeable impact on home values, at least up to a certain point.
Hmm.
But did the study consider other factors that might influence property prices?
Absolutely. They considered property characteristics like the number of bedrooms, bathrooms, car parks, and land size. These factors all had a positive correlation with sale prices.
That's not surprising. Larger homes with more amenities usually command higher prices regardless of location.
Indeed. They also looked at location features like distance to the CBD and elevation. Properties closer to the CBD fetched higher prices, which is understandable given the convenience.
In elevation.
Homes at higher elevations sold for more even after considering other factors, including AEP rating. This suggests that people inherently understand that higher ground offers some protection from flooding. It might be subconscious, but it affects what they're willing to pay.
Especially given those significant floods the Hawkesbury-Nepean Valley has recently experienced. Experiencing a flood or even seeing its aftermath would definitely highlight the value of higher ground. It's not just about damage to the property, but accessibility and safety during a flood.
Exactly. A home on higher ground might be less likely to be cut off from essential services or evacuation routes during a major flood. That peace of mind can translate into higher property values.
So while the AEP provides a quantifiable measure of flood risk, it's clear that other factors like property features, location, and even perceived safety play a role in how the market values homes in flood-prone areas.
That's right. It's a complex interplay of factors, and this study gives us valuable data to help understand those dynamics, which is crucial as we face increasingly frequent and intense flooding due to climate change.
Speaking of how people respond to risk, the study also explored how accurately people perceive flood risk and how that perception might be affected by certain biases.
They looked into the concept of cognitive limits, which means that people can only process so much information when making decisions, especially in complex situations like assessing flood risk. It's about understanding the limitations of human rationality. We aren't always perfectly logical, particularly when dealing with infrequent but high-impact events like floods.
And their findings support this. They saw that while people generally responded to upgrades in risk from AEP 1000 to AEP 500, they didn't seem to react when their risk was upgraded from above AEP 1000 to AEP 1000.
Right. It's as if once the probability drops below a certain point, it gets mentally filed under unlikely or no big deal, even though a flood could have significant consequences.
And this has implications for how we communicate about flood risk and develop policies to encourage mitigation and preparedness.
Exactly. If people don't fully grasp the potential risks, it can lead to a false sense of security and a lack of action to protect themselves and their properties.
They also found that people in areas that haven't experienced recent flooding were more optimistic about future floods, even if their property was in a flood zone.
It goes to show how powerful personal experience or the lack of it can be in shaping our perceptions of risk. It's a case of out of sight, out of mind. If you haven't personally seen the damage a flood can do, it's easy to downplay the risk, even when presented with statistical evidence.
This can create a dangerous gap between perceived risk and actual risk, making people more vulnerable to future flooding. But did the study offer any solutions for addressing these issues with risk perception?
It emphasizes that clear and effective risk communication needs to go beyond just flood maps and data. It's about helping people understand what those numbers mean for their lives and their properties.
It's about making the risk real and relatable. For example, instead of simply stating a 1% chance of flooding each year, they could frame it as a 25% chance of flooding over a 30-year mortgage.
Exactly. That makes the risk more concrete and highlights the potential financial consequences, which can be a powerful motivator for action. They also stress incorporating flood risk into land use planning and building codes.
It's about being proactive rather than reacting after a flood.
Right. It requires coordinated effort from policymakers, planners, developers, and the community.
So this study gives us a lot of information to understand how flood risk affects home values and how people perceive and respond to that risk. What are your thoughts on the study's approach?
They took a thorough approach. They used a massive data set of over 6,000 house sales in the Richmond area from 1991 to 2023. This allowed them to analyze long-term trends and see how the market reacts to changing flood risks.
That's particularly valuable given the shift in the Hawkesbury to Nepean Valley from a drought-dominated cycle to a flood-dominated cycle. Having data that covers both periods gives us a more complete understanding of how the market adapts.
Definitely. But they didn't just look at real estate data, they also incorporated flood maps from both 2019 and 2023, allowing them to analyze how those updated risk assessments affected property values.
Right, we discussed how some properties were reclassified into higher risk zones after the flood map update. Comparing the 2019 and 2023 maps lets researchers see how those changes in perceived risk influenced prices.
Exactly. It's a clever way to see how the market reacts to new information about flood risk and underscores the importance of up-to-date flood maps. They didn't just visually inspect the flood maps, though. They digitized the data and aligned it with property transactions using coordinates, which provided a more precise analysis of flood risk.
That's important because it ensures consistency and avoids errors that can come with human interpretation.
Yes, it adds objectivity and rigor to the analysis. They also use sophisticated statistical techniques to separate the impact of flood risk from other factors that might influence prices.
So they were thorough in making sure the findings were solid.
They used various models to account for property features, location market trends, and even spatial dependencies between properties.
So it wasn't just about flood risk. They consider the whole picture.
Exactly. That's crucial in a study like this, where you want to be sure that any effects you see are really due to flood risk and not some other factor.
This study clearly lays a strong foundation for understanding the connection between flood risk and property values.
It highlights the importance of using rigorous methods to understand complex systems and inform good decision-making.
And those decisions aren't just for policymakers. Individuals need to take this information into account too.
Absolutely. The findings emphasize the need for a comprehensive approach to flood risk. It's not just about physical infrastructure like levees and dams, but also about community education and how people respond to risk.
It's about recognizing that flood risk is a social issue that requires a holistic approach to mitigation and adaptation.
Exactly. We need to foster a culture of flood resilience where individuals and communities understand the risks and take action to protect themselves.
The study also stresses the importance of keeping flood maps up to date. People need this information to make smart choices about where they live and how they protect their properties.
It's about transparency and access to information. People need accurate data to make informed decisions about their risk and potential mitigation strategies.
The findings also have implications for the insurance industry. They highlight the need for solutions that make flood insurance more affordable, especially for those in high-risk areas who might struggle to afford it.
It's about ensuring that everyone can access financial protection against flood damage. It requires insurers, policymakers, and community leaders to work together to develop solutions for the challenges of flood risk in a changing climate.
It's a shared responsibility to build a more resilient future for everyone.
Precisely.
This has been a deep dive indeed, and we've covered a lot of ground. What's your key takeaway from all of this?
This study is a reminder that flood risk is not just an environmental issue, it's also a financial one that requires careful planning and proactive solutions. It's about understanding the risks, taking preventative measures, and working together to build stronger, more resilient communities.
Well said. We'll continue our deep dive into this research in Part 2, where we'll explore the study's limitations and its implications for future research. Stay tuned for more insights into the fascinating world of flood risk and decision-making.
So as we dig deeper into this study on flood risk and home values, it's important to remember that, like any research, it has its limitations.
Right. Understanding those limitations helps us interpret the findings accurately and identify areas for future research. What are some of the limitations the authors themselves point out?
One thing is the study's geographic focus. It looks specifically at Richmond, New South Wales, Australia. And while the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley provides valuable insights because of its extensive history of flooding, the findings might not be completely applicable to other regions that have different flood patterns, different housing markets, or even different cultural contexts.
So while this study offers valuable information, we need to be careful about generalizing its conclusions to other areas without more research.
Exactly. Each location has its own unique features that influence flood risk and its impact on property values.
The authors also mentioned some limitations related to the available data. They acknowledged that their data set lacks some information on certain property features, like the home's condition or any flood mitigation measures that the owner might have already taken.
Right. Those factors could potentially affect property values, and they might not be fully accounted for in the study's analysis. For instance, a renovated or elevated home in a high-risk zone might actually sell for more than a comparable home that hasn't been updated.
So while the study controlled for many characteristics, there might be some hidden factors that could potentially skew the results.
Exactly. It's something to keep in mind when interpreting the findings. The authors also mention limitations related to the availability of specific data points, like the property's time on market and the list price.
Okay.
And this limited the sample size for those specific analyses, potentially impacting the strength of those findings.
It shows that we need comprehensive and thorough data collection when we're studying complex issues like flood risk and its impact on property values.
Mm-hmm.
More data means a more complete and comprehensive understanding.
Absolutely. Robust data is essential for sound research and informed decision-making. And the authors also acknowledge that their focus was primarily on the quantitative aspects of flood risk and its impact on home values. They didn't go as deep into the qualitative aspects, like how individuals actually perceive and experience flood risk,
Right.
or how those perceptions shape their decisions.
That's an important point because numbers only tell part of the story. Understanding the human element is crucial for developing effective strategies to deal with floods.
Absolutely. It's about acknowledging that flood risk is not just a statistic. It's a lived experience with potentially profound emotional, social, and economic effects on individuals and communities.
To get at those nuanced experiences, we need qualitative research methods, like interviews, focus groups, ethnographic observations. These methods can provide valuable insights into the human side of flood risk.
It's about going beyond just the numbers and trying to understand the personal stories behind them.
So while this study offers a very valuable quantitative analysis, it kind of highlights the need for future research to explore those qualitative aspects of flood risk perception and decision-making.
Absolutely. That's a crucial area for future research. It could help us develop more effective risk communication strategies and policy interventions that resonate with people's real-life experiences.
The authors offer some really great suggestions for building on their work and expanding our knowledge of this complex issue. What are some of their suggestions?
One area for future research is investigating the cognitive limits of perceived risk that are associated with other environmental hazards like coastal inundation, bushfires, and earthquakes, particularly when probability factors are involved in assessing the potential damages.
That's an important area to explore. We talked about the evidence of a threshold when it comes to understanding and responding to flood risk. And it would be very interesting to see if similar thresholds exist for these other hazards and how they might vary depending on the type of risk or individual experiences and cultural background.
It's about understanding the nuances of risk perception and how all these different factors beyond just statistical probabilities can influence it.
Another really promising area for future research is using more innovative methodologies in risk assessment, like things like advanced data analytics, machine learning, or behavioral economics. These could really give us a deeper understanding of how risk perception actually affects property values and decision-making.
These cutting-edge approaches could revolutionize how we assess and communicate risk. They can help us identify patterns and trends that more traditional methods might miss.
They can also provide some insights into the psychological and behavioral factors that influence how people perceive and respond to risk.
For instance, machine learning algorithms could analyze large data sets of real estate transactions, social media posts, and news articles to identify emerging trends in risk perception and how those trends affect property values.
That type of analysis could be invaluable for policymakers, planners, and developers who are trying to create more resilient communities.
It could also help insurers develop more targeted and effective risk mitigation strategies.
Absolutely. The potential applications are vast and exciting.
The authors also recommend exploring the effectiveness of different risk communication strategies in overcoming cognitive biases and promoting informed decision-making.
This is really crucial because, as we've discussed, simply providing flood maps and data isn't always enough to actually change behavior.
Right. It's about finding ways to make the risk tangible and relatable. We need to appeal to people's emotions and values and frame information in a way that resonates with their experiences and motivates action.
This requires a very deep understanding of human psychology and behavior, which is where fields like behavioral economics and communication science come in.
That's right. And the authors also emphasize the importance of longitudinal studies that actually track changes in risk perception and behavior over time.
This type of research can really help us understand how people adapt to changing flood risks and it can reveal the effectiveness of various mitigation and adaptation strategies.
It can also provide insights into the long-term impacts of flood events on individual communities and the housing market.
So this study doesn't just offer insights into flood risk and home values. It lays the groundwork for a really strong agenda for future research.
It encourages researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to delve deeper into the complexities of flood risk decision-making and resilience building.
It's an invitation to explore innovative methodologies, engage with diverse communities, and embrace a holistic approach that considers both the quantitative and qualitative dimensions of this complex issue.
Absolutely. And as we conclude this segment on limitations and future research directions, let's circle back to the practical implications for those considering buying or selling or living in flood-prone areas.
That's really important because ultimately this research is about empowering people to make informed decisions that protect their finances and enhance their resilience to flood risk.
The findings highlight how important it is to be proactive and thorough when assessing flood risk. Don't just rely on the seller's disclosures or anecdotal evidence from neighbors. Take the time to actually research the property's flood history, consult flood maps, and talk to experts like insurance agents or flood mitigation specialists to get a comprehensive understanding of the risks.
It's also crucial to factor in the potential cost of flood insurance when you're making financial calculations.
Yeah. Premiums can vary significantly depending on the location and flood risk rating.
Okay.
Get quotes from multiple insurers and really understand the coverage options.
And don't be afraid to negotiate with the seller to include the cost of flood insurance or maybe potential mitigation measures in the purchase price.
Absolutely. It's about protecting your investment and making a sound financial decision.
Beyond the financial considerations, it's also really important to think about the practical implications of living in a flood-prone area.
Like what?
Like, do you have an evacuation plan in place for your family and pets in case of a flood?
Mm.
Do you have a safe place to store valuables or important documents? Have you taken any stinks to flood-proof your property?
Like what?
Like installing flood vents or elevating appliances.
These are all critical questions to consider before choosing to live in a flood-prone area.
It's about being prepared and minimizing any potential disruption or damage from a flood. And remember, flood risk isn't static. It's dynamic. Climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of floods in many parts of the world.
It is. So staying informed about the latest flood risk assessments and projections for your area is crucial. Be ready to adapt your plans accordingly.
It's about maintaining vigilance and preparedness.
Yes.
And recognizing that flood resilience is about protecting lives, livelihoods, and the well-being of our communities.
We encourage you to reflect on the study's findings and think about how they might inform your own decisions about flood risk and building resilience.
Whether you're a homeowner, a renter, a policymaker, or just a concerned citizen, we all play a role in creating a more flood-resilient future.
That starts with understanding the risks, being prepared, and working together to build stronger communities.
And that leads us to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore the broader implications of this study and what it means for the future. Stay tuned as we delve into the challenges and opportunities of creating a more flood-resilient world. As we wrap up our examination of flood risk and its influence on home values, let's step back and consider the broader context of this issue and its implications for the future.
This study is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Flood risk is a multifaceted challenge, and it's made even more complex by things like climate change, urbanization, and other global trends.
It's not a challenge that's going away anytime soon. In fact, it's likely to become more pressing in the years ahead. So what can we do to move beyond just understanding the problem and start taking action to actually reduce flood risk and build resilience in our communities?
Well, there's no single solution. It requires a multifaceted approach involving collaboration between policymakers, planners, developers, insurers, and individuals.
We need to recognize that flood risk isn't just an environmental or financial issue. It's a societal issue that affects everyone in some way.
We need to kind of shift our mindset away from just reacting to floods after they happen and start prioritizing prevention, mitigation, and adaptation.
We need to move from a culture of disaster response to a culture of disaster resilience. What are the key components of building this culture of resilience?
I think awareness is absolutely crucial. People need to understand the risks and the potential consequences of flooding. That's where effective risk communication is vital. It's about going beyond just providing flood maps and data. We need to make the risk tangible and relevant to people's lives.
We need to use stories, visuals, and language that resonate with people's emotions and values to make the information really hit home.
Exactly. Planning is another crucial element. We need to integrate flood risk into land use planning and building codes. That means avoiding development in high-risk areas, designing flood-resistant infrastructure, and incorporating flood mitigation measures into new construction.
Investing in flood mitigation infrastructure like levees, dams, and stormwater management systems is also crucial.
Yeah, these investments can be expensive up front, but they ultimately reduce the damage and disruption caused by floods. They're a long-term investment in our safety and well-being.
And it's important to remember that flood mitigation isn't just about large-scale projects. Individuals can take steps to protect their own properties too.
Right, things like installing flood vents, elevating appliances, and landscaping to divert water away from homes can significantly reduce flood damage.
Insurance is another critical aspect of flood resilience. It provides financial protection against the cost of flood damage. But as we've discussed, affordability and accessibility are major challenges.
Yeah, we need to explore innovative insurance solutions that are more equitable and sustainable. This might involve government subsidies, risk pooling mechanisms, or parametric insurance, which pays out based on predefined triggers rather than actual damage assessments.
The goal is to ensure that everyone has access to financial protection against flooding. It's about shared responsibility and finding solutions that work for everyone.
Beyond those practical measures, building flood resilience also requires changes in social norms and behaviors.
We need to develop a sense of shared responsibility for managing flood risk. That means working together as communities to prepare for floods, support each other during those events, and learn from our experiences.
We're all in this together, and our individual actions really do contribute to our collective resilience.
This deep dive has taken us from the individual impact of flood risk on home values to the broader global trends and societal shifts involved.
We've explored the complexities of flood risk, the limitations of human perception, the importance of data and technology, and the power of collective action.
We've gained, I think, a much deeper understanding of the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead for building a more flood-resilient future.
It's a future where innovation, equity, and collaboration help us create communities that are not only prepared for floods, but can thrive despite them.
That's definitely a future worth striving for. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's been informative and insightful. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the issues that matter.